Trigger warning. This episode describes graphic acts of violence and murder. Listener discretion is advised.
Bygone Echoes.
Welcome to Bygone Echoes, a history podcast. I'm your host, Courtney. Friends, today we are going to venture into the mysterious and eerie world of the Cleveland Torso murders, because who doesn't love a good old-fashioned unsolved mystery with a dash of 1930s noir? Picture it. Cleveland in the 1930s, the Great Depression has hit Americans hard. The air was thick with jazz, prohibition woes, and the scent of freshly baked apple pie cooling on a windowsill. But beneath this seemingly ordinary facade, Cleveland was grappling with something far more sinister. In a time when swing dancing was all the rage, the city of Cleveland had its very own version of Jack the Ripper, only creepier. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, as he was chillingly known, was responsible for a series of gruesome and perplexing murders that left everyone, from local citizens to the famed lawman Eliot Ness, scratching their heads. And we are not just talking about any murders. We are talking about a killer who had a very particular MO, dismembering and beheading his victims and leaving their torsos for all to find. In today's episode, we'll be uncovering the grim details of the Mad Butcher's murders, exploring the gritty world of 1930s Cleveland, Ohio, and we'll piece together the clues that baffled even the sharpest minds of the time. We'll also examine how the Great Depression and societal undercurrents, including Prohibition's legacy of crime and corruption, influenced this terrifying series of events. Because remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got to now and where we might be heading next. So grab your fedoras and your magnifying glasses, and let's get ready to step back in time to a world where danger lurked around every corner, and no one could guess when the Mad Butcher might strike next. Stay tuned. This is one unsolved mystery you will not want to miss. Let's set the scene. The 1920s and 30s were a rough decade for many around the globe. Europe was simmering with political upheaval. They're still suffering from the repercussions of the Great War, aka World War I, my favorite war. The rise of fascism in Italy and Germany were casting a long, dark shadow over the continent, setting the stage for the catastrophic events that would soon unfold. In Asia, Japan was aggressively expanding its empire, leading to conflicts and colonization efforts that brought turmoil and suffering to many in the region. Over in South America, countries were wrestling with economic instability, political unrest, and social strife. Now, let's zoom in on the United States, who is already years into Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Those pushing for the amendment, they had good intentions. They wanted to curb the social issues associated with drinking, but they end up creating an entirely new set of problems. Prohibition led directly to a massive rise in organized crime. Speakeasies, which were illegal bars hidden away in basements and back rooms of establishments, flourished. Bootleggers made fortunes smuggling liquor, and mobsters such as the Mayfield Road Mob made their names through violent turf wars. The police were often outmatched and underfunded, and corruption was rampant. Enter Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, a group of federal agents who gained fame by seeming incorruptible in their efforts to stop illegal access to alcohol. They were hailed as heroes by many in their day for their relentless efforts to bring down Al Capone in Chicago. But teams like the Untouchables were rare, and honestly, their exploits were often exaggerated. In 1933, the 18th Amendment was repealed. It brought back legal alcohol, but it also left a legacy of crime and corruption that persisted well into the 1930s and 40s. The infrastructure for illicit activities had been established, and they did not just disappear overnight. This, combined with the economic struggles of the Great Depression, created a perfect storm for social instability. The Great Depression hit the entire nation, plunging millions into unemployment and poverty. This was like the 2008 Great Recession, but it was way worse. The once booming economy had come to a screeching halt after the stock market crash of 1929. By the mid-1930s, cities across the country were struggling to cope with the widespread economic despair. At the height of the Great Depression, almost 25% of Americans were considered unemployed. It is also important to note that unemployed didn't just mean people who weren't working, in case anyone else is as naive as I was coming into this. The term unemployed, even today, is much more complex than it's given credit for. During the Great Depression, unemployment numbers primarily counted white men who were not working. Maybe they were laid off or their jobs were eliminated, but they were also actively searching for work. That's it. That made up the majority of unemployment figures. So who did we miss? Well, this did not include farmers who saw their lifestyles completely uprooted by the Great Depression and Dust Bowl. It does not reliably include women because during the 1930s, traditional gender roles were the norm and men were expected to be the sole breadwinners. But we forget that sometimes these people die. They leave the family or they aren't involved in the family. Minorities were missed because on top of facing discrimination in society, including in the workplace, they were overall undercounted. Discouraged workers, those who had given up looking for work because they believed no jobs were available, were not included in the unemployment counts. Underemployed is also frustratingly never counted because if you worked part-time or you worked a job well below your skill level, you still technically were employed. But let's just say you were lucky enough to find a job or keep your job. How fortunate. Those who were working saw their incomes drop by nearly half. But not everyone suffered during this time. People such as Joseph Kennedy Sr., the father of future President Kennedy, actually became richer by doing what today would be considered unethical practices, such as insider trading. But that's a story for another day. Among the cities hit hard by the Great Depression was Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland had historically been a bustling industrial hub. It was known for its steel production and manufacturing. The city was home to beautiful grand theaters, bustling department stores, and it held a vibrant cultural scene. Immigration was at an all-time high to the city as people were drawn to the promise and the opportunity that Cleveland seemed to hold. Yet, despite the economic prosperity, Cleveland was marked by significant wealth disparity. Wealthy industrialists and business owners enjoyed very luxurious lifestyles. People like John D. Rockefeller owned beautiful, decadent mansions on the exclusive stretch of Euclid Avenue called Millionaire's Row. While they lived the high life, most of their employees lived in poverty. Cleveland was incredibly vulnerable to economic downturns due to its reliance on manufacturing. The city's economy was heavily tied to national and global markets, making it susceptible to economic shocks. So, when the Great Depression hit, the city keenly felt it. Unemployment rates were sky high, and many families found themselves struggling to make ends meet. The wealth disparity became even more glaring, with opulent mansions standing in stark contrast to the shantytowns that had sprung up in the city's less fortunate areas. One such shantytown was Kingsbury Run, located on the southeast side of Cleveland, Ohio. Named after James Kingsbury, an early white settler, in 1797, this area was part of the Western Reserve, a portion of land in the Ohio Territory that had been claimed initially by the Connecticut colony. I probably should cut this part from the episode because it is not super relevant, but hey, here we are. Last episode, we talked about Connecticut and their witch trials, and look at us. Today, we are talking about Connecticut again. That's nothing to do with the story besides Kingsbury was from there, but I've never thought about Connecticut so much in my life, which is cool. Anyway, back to Kingsbury Run. So Kingsbury Run is part of a winding natural watershed where creeks drain stormwater into the Cuyahoga River from areas around Cleveland. In the late 1800s, Cleveland commissioned a new sewer tunnel system project. This was constructed to pass through the Kingsbury Run area under one of the streets. And then in the early 1900s, this area was actually doing really great due to its proximity to the railroads and industrial centers of the city. However, as the Great Depression took hold, Kingsbury Run transformed into a desolate neighborhood and a refuge for the city's most vulnerable populations. I wanted to point out some terms related to this specific population during the Great Depression. You had hobos. These were men who had lost everything and traveled from town to town by hopping freight trains in search of work and a better life. This is different than a tramp who only worked when necessary, which was also different than a bum who didn't work at all. I had no idea. I've always used those terms interchangeably, but apparently they mean different things. Hobos were willing to do any job they could find, and their lives were marked by uncertainty and hardship. And it was symbolized by their iconic bindles, the sticks with the little package baggy thing at the end of it, and their worn-out clothes as they walked the railroad tracks looking for opportunities. The community of Kingsbury Run included passing hobos, displaced World War I veterans, out-of-work laborers, and those who had simply fallen on hard times. During the Depression, these people were often overlooked and marginalized by society. They created makeshift shelters from whatever materials they could find and lived in harsh and often dangerous conditions with limited access to basic necessities like clean water and medical care. Despite the hardships brought about by the Great Depression, a sense of community existed in Cleveland. People looked out for one another, often sharing what little they had. The city of Cleveland, hoping to boost spirits and create opportunities, even hosted a Great Lakes exhibition, honoring the city's achievements, exploring its future, and showcasing the diverse immigrant population. It actually aimed to be a World's Fair similar to what we talked about in the first episode with the Columbian Exposition, but it did not quite make the cut. But it did help boost the local economy, which was his primary goal. And so it's within this context, an industrial city reeling from economic collapse, a society grappling with the aftershocks of prohibition, and a community living in despair and trying to make the best of it, that the terror of the Mad Butcher unfolded. This series of unsolved gruesome murders would haunt Cleveland for years to come. In 1934, one of the strongest dust storms of the Dust Bowl brought topsoil from places like Texas and Kansas all the way to Chicago and even as far as New York City, blotting out monuments such as the Statue of Liberty. Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down during a police ambush in Louisiana, and in Cleveland, a 30-year-old white woman went missing. Her disappearance was never reported, and we'd probably never even know she existed if it wasn't for a fateful day in September 1934. Her torso, with thighs still attached but amputated at the knees, just casually washed up on the shore of Lake Erie and was discovered by a young man who just so happened to be taking a walk. She was dubbed the Lady in the Lake. And although police found additional body parts, they were never able to locate her head. Oddly, her body was covered in some sort of homebrew of chemical preservatives, causing her skin to appear red, tough, and leathery. At first, her death was not linked to a serial killer at all, but it was later considered one of his first grisly acts. Also in 1934, Cleveland welcomed Elliot Ness as the city's safety director. With the end of Prohibition, the team of Untouchables had been disbanded. Cleveland was riddled with corruption, even in the police force, and Ness, with his upstanding record and Boy Scout-like demeanor, was selected to oversee the police and fire departments. He took it upon himself to clean up the police force, introduce modern police practices and forensic sciences, and sought to improve the overall safety of the city. From 1934 through 1935, Ness led a very ambitious campaign to rid the city of crime and corruption. During that time, on the southeast side of Cleveland, two local boys were having fun climbing an embankment in Kingsbury Run known as Jackass Hill. They probably climbed this hill 1,000 times before, and they took advantage of the pleasant weather on this late September day. They raced to the top of the mountain, but immediately stopped in their tracks. They had accidentally made a gruesome discovery. The police were alerted, and they found not only one headless man, but two, each emasculated and drained of blood. The police report read,
"The bodies of two white men, both beheaded, lying in the weeds. Both bodies were naked except that one of them had socks on. After an extensive search, the heads of both men were found buried in separate places, one about 20 feet away from one of the bodies, and the other head was buried about 75 feet away from the other body. We also found an old blue coat, light cap, and a blood-stained Union suit. Nearby was a metal bucket containing a small quantity of oil and a torch."
Strangely, the men appeared to be covered in the same homebrewed muck as the Lady in the Lake, although I don't think the connection had been made yet that the crimes were linked. The news shocked the city and drew immediate media attention. One of the men was never identified. The other man was eventually determined to be a man with a very questionable reputation who lived on the fringes of society, named Edward Andrassy. In January 1936, another body was found. This time it was a woman, discovered near the East 55th Street Bridge. Like the previous victim, she had been decapitated and her body was mutilated. The killer's signature, decapitation and dismemberment, was becoming disturbingly clear. The police investigated the crimes thoroughly, even employing new forensic techniques that were introduced by Ness, such as fingerprinting and the use of the city's first crime lab, using advanced forensic techniques to analyze the evidence found at the scene. But it got nowhere. In the summer of 1936, Cleveland hosted the Great Lakes Exhibition, which celebrated the city's centennial with exhibits and rides, and it drew over 4 million visitors. It seriously helped boost the city's economy during the Depression, and overall, it was a success. The police also used this opportunity to try to identify one of the butcher's latest victims, known only as the Tattooed Man. Back in this time, groups that would get tattoos typically included sailors, soldiers, circus performers, and members of certain subcultures such as criminals. His tattoos were apparently very unique, and so the police created a plaster reproduction of the man's head, along with a diagram of the kind and location of tattoos on his body, and displayed these at the police booth during the exhibition. Could you imagine? You're a child, you're walking through the Great Lakes Exhibition, the sights you see, the culture you experience, the sense of popcorn and fair foods, you're playing games on the midway, you're having the time of your life. And then you get to the police booth, and you see the plaster of a dead man's head on display. That is actually what happened. There is a direct quote from a man who recalled it from his childhood, the experience of seeing the tattooed man's death mask.
"His features were so peaceful and lifelike, as if he might open his eyes at any moment.
I also swear that I read somewhere that this man also said the experience gave him nightmares for years to come. Fun fact, you can see this death mask and other death masks from a few other victims today at the Cleveland Police Museum. We also have a few pictures on our website. The fourth victim was successfully identified as Florence Polillo, and she was discovered in pieces between two different locations. She had been a waitress and a barmaid, and she was known for frequenting the area's cheap hotels. 7 more unidentified bodies were found between 1936 and 1938. Some were found out in the open, others in more secluded spots, some were around the Cuyahoga River, some were slightly further out, some were recently deceased, and others were in various stages of decomposition. Initially, Elliot Ness kept a low profile when it came to the Mad Butcher murders, assigning others to the case but keeping tabs on it from afar. But as the case went on, the Mad Butcher proved to be an adversary like no other. The investigation was intense and exhaustive. Ness employed every resource available, from seasoned detectives to the latest forensic techniques. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on thousands of leads, and even enlisted the help of psychiatric experts. But the Mad Butcher remained a ghost in the shadows. The press had a field day with each new discovery, sensationalizing the murders, soon criticizing Ness and his inability to catch the killer, all the while keeping the public on edge. All of the victims had been decapitated, most were dismembered, and the cause of death for many had been decapitation, as in, they were decapitated while still alive. The victims were men and women of various ages, but they were all from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and one victim was possibly identified as a Black woman named Rose Wallace, but no firm identification of her was ever made. One particularly disturbing aspect of the case was the killer's apparent medical knowledge. The precise dismemberment of the body suggested that the Mad Butcher had some understanding of anatomy, leading to the speculation that the killer could be a doctor or even a butcher, someone in their own community. When the final 2 bodies were found, tauntingly within view of Elliot Ness's office window, he'd had enough, and 2 days later, he resorted to very drastic measures. The night of August 18th, 1938 was dark and eerie in Kingsbury Run. Elliot Ness, our famed crime fighter, swooped in with a posse of 35 police officers and detectives. We're talking 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, and 3 fire trucks, rolling into the largest collection of makeshift shacks in Kingsbury Run. Ness's crew began sweeping south through Kingsbury Run, rounding up around 63 men in the process, and as dawn broke, the policemen and firemen scoured the now empty shanties for any clues they could find. And then, in a controversial move ordered by Safety Director Ness himself, set the entire shanty town ablaze, burning it to the ground. I mean, in some ways, I sort of get it. If you remove the killer's hunting ground, who will they kill? But also, these men have nowhere else to go, and Ness, described by friends as usually a kind individual who'd give you the shirt off his back, was totally aloof about the entire situation. The aftermath? Oh, the press had a field day. They tore into Ness for his heavy-handed approach. The raid led to, basically, the eviction of 300 squatters, as well as the burning of at least 100 shanty homes. The public was left feeling just as scared and frustrated as before. The timeline of events, at least from what I pieced together, is not totally clear, but it sounds like after the raid on Kingsbury Run, the Cleveland murders abruptly ended, although at the time they didn't know that it was over. The Cleveland police force interviewed hundreds of suspects, but there was never enough evidence to pin the crimes on any single person. But I'm going to share 2 of my favorite theories on who the Mad Butcher was. Dr. Francis Sweeney was a World War I veteran who served in a medical unit that performed field amputations. During the war, Dr. Sweeney suffered from nerve damage due to a gas attack. After the war, he struggled with alcoholism, leading to the end of his marriage in 1934. At some point, he also lived near Kingsbury Run, and it sounds like he also had a medical practice office next to a coroner's office. A source claimed that Sweeney would practice in their morgue, which would have been a very clean and convenient way to kill his victims, and in 1934, a man also claimed that Sweeney had drugged him, but nothing came of these claims. Elliot Ness personally interviewed Sweeney over 2 weeks. He tried to sober Sweeney up enough to take a polygraph test, a new police tool at the time, but Sweeney failed each test due to still being too drunk. Unfortunately, any evidence against Sweeney was purely circumstantial, and Ness doubted that he could even successfully prosecute the man, partly because his cousin was also U.S. Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, who was a vocal critic of Elliot Ness. A few days after being interviewed by Ness, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a mental asylum, Oddly enough, this coincides with the raid on Kingsbury Run, the burning it to the ground, and so the murders also ended at that same time. And Sweeney remained hospitalized for the remainder of his life, and he spent his time while either in veteran hospitals or mental hospitals sending threatening postcards to Eliot Ness until Sweeney finally died in the 1960s. A second theory is related to a series of unsolved murders that occurred between 1921 and 1942, dubbed the Murder Swamp Killings. 9 people, 8 of whom were never identified, were found dead and dismembered in the swamps in or around train yards near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Both Cleveland and Pittsburgh were connected by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line. Remember, we talked about hobos earlier. Many people thought hobos were connected to these crimes somehow. Some of the investigators on the Kingsbury Run case even thought the murders were related. Dismembered bodies were found in the swamps near Newcastle, Pennsylvania and Youngstown, Ohio, between 1921 and 1934. And then again from 1939 to 1942. Remember we talked about Youngstown way back in episode 2, which is weird. Look at things coming full circle. Some wondered whether these murders could have been a result of organized crime. Rumors suggested that mobsters disposed of bodies in the swamps around Youngstown, Ohio and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This connection to organized crime adds another chilling dimension to the already eerie narrative of these unsolved murders. Unfortunately, the killer or killers were never caught. The failure to catch the Mad Butcher haunted Eliot Ness for the rest of his life, a dark blot on his otherwise stellar career. The investigation into the Mad Butcher murders was fraught with controversy, primarily due to the social biases against the victims. Many of the victims were transients with no fixed address, making them less of a priority for authorities and the media alike. This reflected the broader societal prejudices against the poor and the homeless, underscoring the inequality in how different lives were valued. The police were criticized for their slow response times and inadequate investigations, while the media sensationalized the murders without delving into the victims or their lives. A major point of contention was Eliot Ness's decision to raid and burn down the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run in order to flush out the killer. This raid displaced hundreds of vulnerable people, and it yielded no significant leads, but it did lead to widespread criticism of Ness's approach as ineffective and inhumane. Many viewed the decision as punitive measures against the poor, rather than a strategic move in the investigation. Because remember, this was just a few days after the last victims were staged in plain view of Eliot Ness's office. Critics argued that it demonstrated a gross misunderstanding of the social dynamics at play and a disregard for the human cost of such an operation. The raid also sparked outrage among social justice advocates and community leaders who saw it as an egregious abuse of power. They argued that targeting the shantytown did nothing to address the root cause of the problem and instead punished those who were already suffering the most. The controversy surrounding the investigation into the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run highlighted the deep-seated issues of inequality and prejudice in society. The bias against the victims and the extreme measures taken by authorities underscored the broader systematic failures to protect and value all citizens equally. These events forced a reckoning with the ways in which marginalized communities were treated by both law enforcement and society at large, and they remain a reminder of the ongoing struggles for justice and equality today. And so, what happened in Cleveland after the murder stopped? The Torso murder case remains unsolved, casting a shadow over Cleveland. Despite his many accomplishments, Eliot Ness could not shake off his failure to catch the Mad Butcher, and this failure haunted him for the rest of his life. He left Cleveland in 1942, later moved to Pennsylvania, where he tried to build his career but never fully escaped the shadow of Kingsbury Run. He passed away in 1957, largely remembered for his earlier triumphs against Al Capone rather than his struggles in Cleveland. 2 decades after the murders, the city set out to redevelop Kingsbury Run into a low-income housing area as part of the Garden Valley Federal Urban Renewal Project. Constructed on a slag dump donated by Republic Steel, Garden Valley was emblematic of the national tendency in the 1950s to regulate renewal housing to marginal inner-city lands. This redevelopment aimed to transform the area from a symbol of despair into a hopeful community space, but it also underscored the ongoing challenges of urban planning and social equity. Kingsbury Run is still remembered today, mostly for the violent period in Cleveland's history marked by the Mad Butcher's reign of terror. When the city government references this area today, it's often to note that there's a vast sewer system that runs through it, a crucial part of the city's infrastructure. Yet the past still lingers, and it's a grim reminder of the era when fear and murder dominated the headlines. The Kingsbury Run case also spurred advancements in forensic science and investigative techniques. The challenges faced by investigators in the 1930s highlighted the limitations and tools and methods that were available to them at the time. In the following decades, there was a push for better forensic capabilities, including more sophisticated methods for identifying victims and analyzing crime scenes. This drive for improvement has contributed to the modern landscape of criminal investigation, where science and empathy play crucial roles. In contemporary discussions about Kingsbury Run, there is a strong emphasis on social justice. The case is often revisited in the context of how society deals with poverty, homelessness, and mental illness. And it serves as a historical example that informs our current debate on law enforcement reform and the treatment of marginalized populations. So, while the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was never caught, the legacy of these murders has had a profound and lasting impact. It influenced policing practices, highlighted societal biases, and spurred advancements in forensic science. The story remains a chilling reminder of the dark corners of human nature and the ongoing need for justice and empathy in addressing crime and its root causes. Well, friends, that is the tale of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, a story filled with mystery, tragedy, and lessons on the importance of justice and equality. It's a reminder of a time when fear gripped the city of Cleveland and how societal biases can shape the course of justice. The unresolved nature of the case leaves us with haunting questions about the dark corners of human nature and the systematic failures that allowed such horrors to persist. As we reflect on the legacy of Kingsbury Run, it's essential to remember the victims, often marginalized and overlooked, who bore the brunt of society's neglect. Their stories remind us of the critical need for empathy and comprehensive approaches to crime and social issues, ensuring that every life is valued and protected. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Cleveland's past. I hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as I did. History, with all its light and dark moments, teaches us about our past, and it helps us shape a better future. Next time, we'll be exploring another obscure and intriguing corner of history, so stay tuned. And remember, be kind, be curious, and be ready to make history.
Interested in learning more? We recommend In the Wake of the Butcher, Cleveland's Torso Murders by James Jessen Badal, American Demon by Daniel Stashower, the Cleveland Memory Project website for archival materials, the Unsolved Mysteries episode on the Cleveland Torso Murders, and visit us online at bygoneechoes.website for pictures, articles, and more.